So today we have the next webinar, and our speaker is Dr. Steven Simon from Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He will discuss how immigration policy shapes political trust through policy congruence, with effects concentrated among politically engaged anti-immigration citizens. Dr. Simon did his PhD thesis in political science at the University of Bamberg in Germany. He is a political sociologist with expertise in political support, immigrant integration, immigration policy. His research explores how immigration policy outputs impact different elements of social cohesion. He works currently as a research intelligence officer at Maastricht University. And Stephen, the floor is yours. Please start your presentation. Welcome.
Yes, thank you for this very nice introduction. I'm Stefan Simon. I work, as you said, Christian, at the University Library at Maastricht University. And before that, I did my PhD at the University of Bamberg in the Bamberg Graduate School of Social Sciences with a focus on political sociology. And the paper I'm going to present today was part of my dissertation project. And I find it important to, before starting talking about the paper, to contextualize it a little bit in this project. And it had the name "The Impact of Immigration Policy on Social Cohesion in European Countries." So not only political trust, but like different elements of what we call social cohesion. And the dissertation project was embedded in a broader curiosity, namely the question, what is the impact of immigration policy on social cohesion? And it's important for me to point out that I really was wanting to look at policy and not the outcomes of these policies, such as immigration flows, immigrant stock, immigration rates, etc., but really policy as policy outputs, namely concrete policy on paper. But we will get to this later. And why was this question relevant? So back then and still today, there are political debates about, what is the appropriate degree of restrictiveness of immigration policy in a country? And they often centered on the impact restrictiveness has on cohesion. And there's often a frequent assumption, namely that immigration and liberal immigration policies would undermine the ability of a population and a country to connect to each other and to the political system. And to give one of many possible examples for Germany, for instance, according to public discourse, the weak enforcement of asylum policies enabled the recent deadly attacks last year by asylum seekers, for instance, in Solingen, leading to social and political disunity. And overall, according to current political and public discourse, liberal immigration policy is widely seen as bad for cohesion. It would lead to politically alienated and distrustful citizens and insufficiently integrated immigrants, both destabilizing cohesion. And in response, restrictive immigration policies are viewed as necessary to maintain and enhance cohesion. And for instance, after what happened in Solingen, in Germany, the Schengen Agreement was suspended and border controls were reintroduced in Germany. But the argument is basically it is poorly understood whether, to what extent, and under what conditions immigration policies do have any influence on social cohesion. And this was basically the broad idea of the dissertation, that it's a debate with limited scientific basis, which I tried to fill. I wanted to challenge the assumption that restrictions are per se good for cohesion by outlining and testing theoretical mechanisms. And one of those mechanisms is basically the topic of today, policy congruence, and its effect on political trust as one of many elements of social cohesion, and the composition effect, which I looked at in dissertation, but it's not part of today's lecture. So now the paper we are here for, Immigration Policy Congruence and Political Trust, across national analyses in 23 European countries. So it builds on existing evidence. First, that studies show that political trust is good for the stability and the viability of democracy. So when there's high political trust, people tend to pay their taxes, to abide to the law. It's easier for policymakers to adopt redistributive policies. Second, when people perceive that that their own views are substantively represented in policy, then this increases their political trust. And the third evidence I built this research on is that at the time when I wrote the paper and still today, immigration policy is extremely salient and polarizing in public opinion. And this basically led me to an unanswered question, namely, to what extent does substantive representation of individual immigration preferences in the content of immigration policy increase political trust? And this also had a little bit of a kind of, I call it now, practical urgency, which I see in the liberal paradox in migration theory. And it assumes that liberal democracies must reconcile the demands of the public for restrictions with external demands for liberalizations resulting from capitalist interests and constitutionalism when making immigration policy. And this has led to the liberalization, so this kind of reconciliation has led basically to liberalization of immigration policy over the last years, and which, however, predicts strong negative effects of liberal immigration policies for the political trust of people who are against immigration. So to what extent was that research question so far unanswered? So there are studies already looking, or back then when I wrote the paper, that looked at the effects of policies on political trust. But their focus was not on immigration policy, but instead on integration and multiculturalism policies. And these policies differ from immigration policies in the way that they don't look at admission and permission to enter and stay in the country, but instead at the rights an immigrant or a person has after he or she immigrated. For instance, social, cultural, and economic participation. And other studies didn't look at policy outputs, but instead on, the outcomes of immigration policies. For instance, immigration rates, asylum applications, etc. So there's a research gap in the way that studies didn't look at immigration policy, which are policies that regulate who can be admitted and permitted to stay in the country. And to understand policy, as I said before, as policy outputs, namely as concrete laws, regulations, and decisions. So basically the main argument is that to make claims about how substantive representation of a person's preference in the content of immigration policy affects political trust, we have to really look at outputs, at immigration policy outputs. So for a long time, there was a lack of country-level data on immigration policy outputs, which changed when I started my PhD, because my supervisor, Mark Helbling, made this index that I'm using, which for the first time measures quantitatively legislation on immigration in 33, I think, OECD countries for around 30 years, but we'll see this later. So I make one main argument, and two sub-arguments. And the main argument is that when the content of immigration policies matches citizens' preferences, which is basically also already the definition of policy congruence, political trust increases. And the sub-arguments are that there will be heterogeneous effects for anti and pro-immigration people. Restrictive immigration policies will probably increase the political trust of people who are against immigration and decrease the political trust of people who are for immigration. And I argue also that this effect is strengthened when people have more policy knowledge, because when you have more knowledge about the content of the policies, then it's easier for you to compare your own values and attitudes in immigration to the content of the policies. So, and there's also an underlying puzzle. So in the literature, there are contradictory assumptions on how volatile political trust is, because there are researchers saying that political trust is actually quite stable, such as I would argue David Easton. On the other hand, there are people arguing, well, it's political trust. We treat this as a mid-range indicator of support of the political system. So we argue it's more volatile to policy change or to policy in general. So with this paper, I wanted to test this argument for the first time in a systematic way. This is probably something that you as political trust researchers have heard 1,000 times. So I try to be concise. So I treat political trust as citizen support for political institutions. And as you know, and it's a big work by Pippa Norris also, the division between specific and abstract political support, specific support being support of individual politicians, and the more abstract support being the support of the regime principles. And I treat trust in institutions, I treat political trust as trust in institutions, that is trust in the parliament, the political parties, legal system, and politicians, which is a middle range object of political support. It correlates with trust in individual politicians and support for regime principles, but it's different from them. And it's widely seen as a yardstick for a good condition of a democracy. And moreover, I not only treat political trust as trust in institutions, but I also see it as an evaluative orientation. So the people arguing, well, it's something cultural, but I say it's relational. So meaning citizens evaluate political institutions as to whether they act in their interest. Thus, it's relational and situational and rather volatile. So if I agree with the institutions in my country, or with I think policy makers are responsive to what I want, then there can be an increase in political trust. So it's rather volatile to change. But what exactly is evaluated? I argue that political trust results from evaluations of substantive representation, which is given when actions of representatives resemble my substantive ideological preferences. And I focus here on the aesthetic type of substantive representation. An unstatic type would be, for instance, responsiveness, but I talk about ideological congruence, which is that actions of the representative are in line with the interests of the represented at a fixed point in time. And getting to the point now, a condition for ideological congruence is policy congruence, namely the extent to which policy content and citizens' preferences match at a certain point in time. So political trust, I argue, resides from policy congruence, the extent to which a policy content and citizen preference match, and if they match, there is an increase in political trust, and if they mismatch, there's a decrease. So, but there's also an underpinning mechanism. I conceptualize the effect of immigration policy, congruence, and political trust as an interpretive effect. And this is part of policy feedback theory, which argues that policy contents can influence mass public opinion and behavior. And within this policy feedback theory, there's the interpretive effects perspective. And it argues that policies influence public opinion by providing information and meaning regarding the policies. It sends signals, informative signals. So the policy content sends interpretive signals that influence the public's perception about what their own interests are and whether the representatives are protecting those. And this will be important also in a moment. So building from the above, I argue that immigration policies impact political trust heterogeneously, conditional on whether the contents are incongruent with the anti or pro-immigration preferences of citizens. So If there's a match of the content with immigration preference, there's an increase in political trust. If there's a mismatch, there's a decrease. But a condition for immigration policy effects on political trust is that people know about the policies, or at least a little bit. So assuming this as a researcher where people know about the content of policy is questionable. So so I assume that that the seeking of political information or policy knowledge conditions the immigration policy feedback process I talked before. So seeking political information by watching, by reading the newspaper, watching television, etc., should make the contents of the policies more visible, and also more traceable to the actions of politicians and institutions. If I want to, so I need to know basically which policymakers have made the policy. So it must be traceable to the actions of politicians and institutions. And this political information seeking allows people to better compare their own policy positions to those of authorities, to identify incongruencies, and to reward or punish them accordingly. All right, this is it for the theory. Now to the data. So I said before, to measure immigration policy outputs, I used immigration policy in comparison data set, which back then was the most, best data set immigration policy available. It measures immigration policy outputs at country level for 33 OECD countries for the years 1980 to 2010. And well, we see already here the years, it's historic data. So in the end, later we can talk about this, how we basically, what this means for today, the research I've done. It looks at regulations for policy areas, labor migration, refugee and asylum, family reunification, and co-ethnics. And for each policy area, it measures the restrictiveness of eligibility criteria and entry conditions. So basically the selection criteria for a person to be allowed to enter a country of origin, age, money sometimes. Then the restrictiveness of security of status and associated rights. These are the rights that you have after you have already entered a country. For instance, are you allowed to work? So how long are you allowed to stay in a country? And the method behind this was that there was a team of legal experts who coded restrictiveness of immigration laws, and coded them as liberal or restrictive. And after this data was aggregated, there was a huge range between 0 and 1. And 0.5 was important because it got a 0.5 when there was a law at all. And this idea made it also comparable between countries, because this is the idea. So I used only one indicator, an immigration policy indicator, a composite mean score of restrictive measures for labor migration, family reunification, and asylum refugees. I left out co-ethnics because this is something very specific and applies only to a few countries. For instance, in Germany, there are laws about Russian Germans that they're allowed to enter, etc. This is like basically old law. This co-ethnic laws, they don't exist in many countries, so I left it out. So individual level data, I used the European Social Survey, waves 1 to 5, 2002 to 2010. I now only include respondents with legal citizenship, and this is because the argument that I make is about people who are not the target group of immigration policy, namely legal citizens. This overlap with the IMPEC allows me to sample around 180,000 individuals across 23 European countries in 5 years. Because ESS is made every 2 years. So the outcome variable is political trust. ranges from 0 to 10, 0 being low trust and 10 being high trust. And I calculate the mean score of trust in politicians and parliament. And I got also a nice alpha out of this. Moderating variables, I looked at immigration attitudes, which is scored from 0 to 1, 0 being pro-immigration and 1 being anti-immigration. So it's not a dummy, there's a range between. It's a mean score of 6 items. If you have a question about this, we can discuss the variables later. I put them also in the slides. And then political information seeking. So there is no variable on policy knowledge, but I argue that political information seeking is already a good proxy for policy knowledge, because this means you're actively trying to get political information. And for this, I use 2 variables, namely political news exposure, which is also a mean score of 3 items. 0 is low exposure and 7 is high exposure, and political interest. 1 is low interest and 4 is high interest. So this is an overview of the data. On the right side, you see the overview of the countries that are included in which rounds and how many respondents per country. On the left side, table 1, you see an overview of the immigration policy country level indicator and the other variables. And when we look at the immigration policy indicator, is a mean of 0.3, meaning so 0 being liberal and 1 being restrictive. You see that basically on this number, we see that it's already quite skewed to more liberal policies overall. And it ranges from 0.2 to 0.8. Overall, political trust is, on average rather low. Immigration attitudes, quite in the middle. So just a small overview of this. Now to the statistical models. So the analytical strategy was look at the effects of country-level immigration policies on individual political trust. So I matched the data from the European Social Survey with the impact data. And I lagged the impact data by 1 year to prevent reverse causality, that political trust has an effect on immigration policy restrictiveness. And for instance, ESS data from 2002 was matched with impact data from 2001, so that the immigration policy from the previous year is an effect on a potential effect on the political trust of the current year, in this case 2002. So it's time series cross-sectional data. So I use multi-level regression models. I have to see how much time I have left. That's okay. So to do this, I take advice from Schmidt, Katran, and Fairbrother to use random effects at all levels. It's a cross-classified model. I control for individual level factors that have been tested in other studies on political trust, such age, gender, education years, area of living, employment status, migration status, political ideology, and feeling about one's household income. And I control for country level GDP, unemployment rate, and the foreign-born population, which the latter of which are also lagged by 1 year. So basically I have 3 models. The first to test the main argument, to which degree does immigration policy congruence affect political trust? So it's a 2-way interaction between the immigration policy country level indicator and immigration attitudes. The second model 2 and 3, there's the argument to which extent the seeking of political information influences the degree to which immigration attitudes moderate the effect of immigration policy on political trust. So basically it strengthens the policy congruence effect between immigration policy and attitudes. So two-way interaction and three interactions. All models also include random slopes for immigration attitudes. They can vary between the years. The point is that I look at graphic interpretation of the results. So I look at predicted marginal effects, and the immigration policy indicator I've divided into quartiles. You will see this now to make this better interpretable. All right. Yeah, and I set all dummy variables to 0, interval scaled all individual level independent variables, and no, I ascended them at the total grand mean. So it's better interpretable. So the results, to measure the congruence effect, I test whether the effect of restrictiveness on political trust is moderated by citizens' immigration preferences, which I measure with attitudes to immigration. And we can see here that in line with my expectations in the paper, restrictiveness increases the political trust of people who are against immigration. So it's the light gray line at the bottom, and decreases the political trust of people who are pro-immigration. It's the darker line at the top. But looking at this, the effects are substantively, negligible. They're too small. So we can see a trend here, but not an effect. So yeah, as expected, but for each there's just a 0.3 increase on an 11-point scale. So now I test whether the congruence effect is larger for people who have policy knowledge or are seeking political information. And I conceptualize here policy knowledge or seeking political information as self-exposure to political news. In this graphic, we see that for people who are highly anti-immigration and have a high exposure to political news, restrictiveness increases their political trust by 1.3 points on a 0 to 10 scale. So this is the dashed line. But I still argue that the effect is small because all variables in this predicted effects model are set to their extremes. So I also run models with political interest instead of exposure to political news, but the results there are insignificant. So, and the gist of this is that in accordance with the gap hypotheses or the liberal paradox that I've described before, restrictive migration policies increase political trust for anti-immigration people only, and only if they have very high exposure to political news, but the effect is still small. Well, to conclude, there's no substantive effect of immigration policy alone, or immigration policy congruence alone on political trust, neither for opponents nor for supporters of immigration. And it does impact political trust of people who are highly anti-immigration and very strongly seeking political information. And this is, I guess, I argue, important evidence for the literature that investigates how migrant policies like house integration and multiculturalism policies and immigration flows, stock, etc., impact political trust. So the conclusion is immigration policy congruence does impact political trust, but it's very limited in scope to a very small segment of society who is very strongly anti-immigration and also very well politically informed. And then, yeah, of course, I was thinking, well, what does this mean? And it appears that legal regulations are probably just less visible and traceable to the public than their outcomes, thus having a comparably smaller effect on political trust than what other research on the effects of immigration rates find. So the results are then larger. And without using policy knowledge, proxy variables, etc. So yeah, and the study, of course, has limitations. It's older data, it's aggregate data, it's a multi-level model. So there's a lot what can happen in between policy at the highest level and individual level. So we can also argue that individual policies can have an effect, but not only the aggregate. But I've also done some robustness checks using only certain, this is an overview of the data, only looking at certain policy areas like only family unification, labor migration, but the results are not really different. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this interesting talk. We have now Q&A. Who has questions, comments? Yanis says, great work, Stephen.
Thank you.
Aneta, please.
So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And basically your last question about how to interpret this and what basically your findings says about a real society and how those people treat immigration is a great question. And maybe one of the obstacles or maybe some kind of problems with this kind of research might be that you treat citizens as perfectly rational actors. So they would be like knowledgeable about their preferences. That is something that they might be aware of in some kind, in some way, but then they are also like knowledgeable about policy content. And this is what you rightly pointed on, that this is quite questionable. Based on qualitative research we done, I would rather argue that they have a very limited knowledge about the policy on immigration in their own country, and they would rather grasp those political cues. So what politicians say about the policy than to actually knows what is the content of the policy. So this is something that really makes like difficulties for studying this phenomena. But my question would be that you look at the exposure to political news, and this indicator was based on classical sources, news sources, traditional media, or was it more about any kind of media, also online media? The question why I'm asking this is that, for example, in such anti-migration countries as Slovakia, the main anti-migration narratives is shared by alternative media, online sources. So if they would be included, then those people might be more exposed to like the news or maybe information about also anti-immigration or like supporting their stances, but not when they are exposed only to the traditional media, because they have very limited cover of the immigration, that it's not an issue in the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for this. I will share my screen again. One moment. So yeah, thanks for this. So like regarding the first comment, yeah, so I think I also cite Aachen and Bartels to argue that people know very little about politics, and this is of course a challenge in such in such a setting, making a multi-level analysis on the impact of abstract policies on individuals. So I try to make up for this by using policy information seeking as a proxy, and I will get to this in a moment what it actually includes. So, and I've made a follow-up study of this, which is not published yet, where I basically confront people in an experiment with policies and then ask for their political trust, political support. So there, you give them the information. So this is then easier basically to measure whether this has an effect on political trust. And it still didn't, by the way. But I looked at specific policies, asylum, labor migration, etc. Then exposure to political news. One drawback of this research is that I think the last year in the sample is 2010, and I don't even know whether we had social media already then, at least not much. So it's completely very classic. What is measured in the ESS. Let me see. Yeah, so it's here, for instance, TV watching, news, politics, current affairs on average weekday. On average weekday, how much of your time do you watch television, and how much is it about watching news programs about politics and current affairs, radio, same question, reading about politics. So yeah, so this would probably also include reading it on your news app. But yeah, this is basically the question, and would be super interesting also what you say about the country that you're looking at is disinformation. I assume people want to be informed about politics and policy, and looking for what they see in the TV, etc. But I don't assume that people getting disinformation. So this is something to look at now. In another study, what's the role of disinformation or the use of social media and channels such as Twitter or X or etc.
Yes, I think if I may, the Verbal Survey and the European Social Survey has in the older past also all media, television, radio, newspapers. The questions about new media like Facebook, internet, and so on is a recent introduction into demography. So we don't have this usage of new social media 10 years ago, neither in the ESS nor in the WS. That's why we cannot test this hypothesis of Anetta only in the last few years after the importance of new social media exploded. We introduced it into the demography of our surveys. This makes it difficult to study the effect of new social media in surveys which are 15 years old, because we didn't ask about social media. We can only, if we move to newer waves of the ESS and so on, I don't know when ESS started to ask about new media, then we can test this hypothesis, but not for the older data. Claudia?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I think it was the second to last slide where you mentioned something about immigration policy and effects on trust. I wasn't quick enough to write it down. Maybe you can go to this. Okay, so it is, you said, for anti-immigration, high political no effects for political interest. So my question is now, did you observe any countries where low policy congruence didn't erode political trust? What might explain those outliers, or didn't you find any?
Countries where it didn't erode it, you mean?
Pardon? Where it didn't erode?
Yeah, I only looked at the general effect. I don't. So this what I can say here is basically kind of something general in German Aussage, a general what I can say. So that in countries on average, on average when there is an extreme change from very liberal to very restrictive, and this correlates with high exposure to political news. This then decreases political trust or increases political trust. So I cannot say something about specific countries. So just this overall effect.
So I got one question going to the overall effect based on your findings. What would be the key takeaways for policymakers aiming to strengthen political trust while managing immigration in diverse societies?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I was thinking about this as well. And one key takeaway is that basically the effect of restrictive or effective immigration policy and political trust is not that strong. So policymakers who need to make responsible policies, this means they have more leeway to do this. So this was at least the takeaway that I got from this back then when I wrote the paper, because other than often assumed, immigration policy doesn't have such a big effect on political trust. So there is leeway for responsible policies.
Thank you.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
The next statement comes from Yannis Stavrakakis, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. That's a very nice presentation and very interesting topic. I have more of a theoretical question, I think, regarding political trust. And I was wondering what your opinion is on when the narrative of a policy is anti-systemic, is populist, anti-systemic, what would be the correlation perhaps with political trust? So like off the top of my head, Trump's election campaign, immigrants are eating dogs and cats, and extreme statements like that. Also the persona of being anti-systemic and we're gonna come and change the political system and all these things. Is there an antithesis there with like the message and the goal? The message being anti-systemic and the goal trying to build political trust?
Yeah, thanks, Yannis, for this. Yeah, this is also probably very dependent on a person's views. So I wouldn't know what the average effect would be, of anti-systemic policies on political trust. This we would need to test, but it's probably also very partisan dependent on the person's, is this person more liberal? Is this person more conservative, more anti-immigration, or is this person itself maybe has anti-democratic views? So there would be a match with these kind of policies. But I wouldn't know, Yannis. I mean, what I last read is that Trump's overall political support actually decreased. I think he's now at 45%. So
yeah.
This might be evidence of, overall, it's not such a good idea.
Thanks, Stefan.
Yes, Trump went from 52 to 45 as effect of his recent policy. The national director of the World Survey in Armenia, Professor Manasian, likes your work very much in the chat, and she is congratulating you. Okay, we have still 5 minutes or so. So it would be great to make, if you have time, an update with more recent years of this study to see how things have changed in the European Social Survey and also in your data set with your professor.
Yeah, there is a new data set out. So this impact data set has been updated, I think, a year ago or so. So there is new data. I don't know until when it is, but it's also open access data. So I think you can just download it and use it.
Okay. So maybe you can send the link to Xenia and then she can send it to the consortium of our project team. Thank you. All right. Are there any other comments in the chat? There's a question by Xenia. Do you want to tell us or should I read it? I should read it. Xenia, who is the project manager of the Trust in Democracy, is asking you, did the study also consider the actual volume of immigration, independent of policy, as a factor influencing political trust? If not, could the real number of immigrants have a stronger or different effect compared to perceived policy congruence?
Yeah. Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So I used immigration stock, I guess, also lagged as a control variable to precisely basically control for this as well. You know, maybe there's a very restrictive policies, but there was a rise in immigrants at the same time. So what is also interesting to look at would be so what's it called again? That's a political science word for this. A mismatch between the expectations of the policy, what it doesn't deliver. So there can be a policy that is restrictive, but at the same time, maybe it doesn't deliver. So I see a gap between what the policy says and what it makes. I didn't measure this, so it's implicitly in there with this control variable. But yes, this could be a very big factor in explaining political trust. You know, dissatisfaction with policy because it doesn't deliver.
There's a question by Claudia Palt on the chat. Did your analysis suggest any particular types of immigration policies that are more likely to foster political trust when they align with public preferences?
Yeah, so it's also a good one. So this study not, but we can look. You can also look afterwards at the robustness checks. They checked a little bit for specific policy areas. I would need to look at this myself. But what in this follow-up study, what I did is it was an experiment. So this study doesn't suggest it, I guess. But in the follow-up study, I looked exactly at this. For instance, labor migration and asylum policies. So people tend to say, we don't want labor migrants, or because they don't need to come, and they are refugees who need to come because they are being persecuted and need. So there's already a difference in between the preferences of people of different kinds of migration policies. So more positive towards refugees and less positive towards labor migrants. And I see in the study that I did afterwards that there's a bit of a convergence of people on the right and the left, that they are both more positive towards, I think, less restrictive policies for refugees compared to labor migrants. So yes, this is super interesting to look at, but I didn't do this in this particular study.
This is food for future research.
Yeah.
The National Director of the Value Survey Mongolia, Dr. Tsetsen Bilek, thanks you very much for the very informative webinar.
Thanks.
So you get applause from the whole world. From South Caucasus, Central Asia, they all love your work.
Very
Okay,
good.
we have 2 minutes, last 2 minutes. This presentation, this webinar of our famous children project will be published on the YouTube website of our project. There you can watch it again, and is documented as part of our dissemination and communication strategy. Okay, last chance, 2 minutes. Who wants to have the last word? Everybody is completely overwhelmed by research. Okay, thank you, Stephen. It was very impressive. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Let's stay in touch.